sharing capacity.
Yes, and let me get that set up for you.
So are we recording as well, Des?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it'll be live streamed and it'll be recorded.
Great.
Was last week's recorded?
Yes, yeah, it's on our YouTube page,
right.
and I can
I'll get
maybe
it.
update the website.
Thank you.
I never remember to send you. I'll try and somebody remind me at the end. I'll send you somebody. So Des, should probably send it to you. Should I send you the slides?
It might be easier to send it. Either way, I think it'd have to go to Edith if we wanted to send it out to people. So
okay, either way. All right. Let me get going here. I'm gonna share the screen, and so remember last week we're doing, what Oregon is doing, which around responding to the challenge. So I'm sharing my screen with you, and let me turn that into a slideshow. Okay. So I need to get you guys off to the side here. So this is sort of, what we talked a bit about last week. So what kind of action can be taken, right, to meet the challenge at state and regional levels. So by the way, we'll come to it. Some good news from the state of Washington this past week, actually. So remember the three kinds of things we can be doing: adaptation, mitigation, and carbon removal. So adaptation, since greenhouse gas emissions that are already there in the atmosphere aren't going to go away anytime soon, we've got to make sure we do what's necessary to prepare for the impacts that are sure to come and deal with the ones that are happening now. So if you've been watching the news this week, for instance, you saw that there is a potentially killer heat wave in India. I will, at the end of tonight, show you some bibliography that I think is worth paying attention to, and it includes a novel that begins with a science fiction novel that begins with a killing heat wave in India. So it feels a little frightening, actually, to have been reading the news this week. Some adaptation, and Oregon's doing some things on this front that are good, and we'll see that. Mitigation, we know the limits of our carbon budget. We know we have to reduce and eliminate emissions. And the goals that we're setting are pretty ambitious. Nobody's actually moving to achieve them these days, and we may be moving in the wrong direction. But it's a fact of life. This is something we have to do. And Oregon again has done some things that are notable. So the plan was to close Boardman. The 2008 suit that finally was successful in 2011 to force PG's Boardman coal-fired plant to close. It closed ahead of time. They were able to shut it down sooner than they anticipated. So that's another good sign. Oregon's able to do some things. Carbon removal, that's a harder nut to crack at the level that you'd hope, but Oregon does have a lot of working lands as well as forests, where a lot of significant carbon storage and sequestration can be accomplished. So Oregon's got to adopt policies that preserve and really boost the land's ability to store and sequester carbon. So an example, the one I list here, extending the age of trees for harvest to no less than 80 years. So private forest lands, and some of you may have seen the lawsuit that was, let's see what actually happened yesterday. The ruling was that the state is not on the hook for billions of dollars of county and private losses because of slowed forest harvesting. That actually was good news from this perspective, although that court case is almost certainly going to go to the Oregon Supreme Court. So these are the things we got to be doing. So let's make sure I get the right slide here. Yes. So I think the thing we focus on here, hold on a sec. I need to get rid of my daughter's dog, who will just stand and stare at me the whole time I do this. Go on, Rosie, out. I always say my daughter's dog. It's actually our dog now, my dog, I think. And she is hooked on me. But so this business of mitigation, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's helpful for people to understand this more technical sort of stuff, because it's the kind of stuff we have to get used to if we're going to really deal with this. So first thing to note is any greenhouse gas emission is a function of economic activity. That's just the reality. And we are economic beings. We're going to be engaged in economic activity to survive and to flourish. So every good or service we produce potentially has a greenhouse gas emission attached to it. We measure those goods and services as gross domestic product, okay? There's a really standard formula for understanding emissions as a result of that kind of activity. And it's called the Kaya identity, or the IPAT, better IPAT. So total emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the stuff that's up there, we were talking about it last week a little bit. That's impact, big I, and that's a function of population times the affluence of a society times the greenhouse gas intensity. That is the intensity of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from that. So any kind of mitigation, it really entails reducing the impact by reducing P, A, or T, right? So it seems simple. It's not, once we start looking at it, it's not all that simple. So we have to sort of explain intensity. So a greenhouse gas's intensity is, again, the greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP. That's the way we measure it. So for every dollar gross domestic product, there's a certain amount of energy that's expended to do that. That's a function. So T, that is the intensity, is a function of energy intensity. So the joules of energy, don't need to worry about what a joule is, just consider it a unit of energy that are necessary to generate a single dollar of goods and services. So for instance, to produce steel, obviously, the joules of energy necessary to do that are considerably greater than producing learning in a university, keeping the lights on, or, as the sun gets brighter and the days get warmer, students would prefer that we sit outside. So no greenhouse gases, right? That's, again, a function. So energy intensity times carbon intensity. In other words, how much greenhouse gas is emitted per joule of energy. So coal, oil, natural gas, obviously produce GHGs. There we go. Sorry, I shouldn't hit my desk. There we go. Oh, come on. I've got to go back a slide. Anyway, carbon intensity is the amount of amount of greenhouse gas emitted. So wind, solar, water, obviously not producing GHGs. So back up here. So the reason I focus on this is because these are the sort of ways of thinking about each of those potential targets for action. So remember, if we go back to that slide, we have to reduce impact by reducing P, A, or T, that is population, affluence, or intensity. Growth of population, that's not something we have control over, right? It's a function of individual choices. And certainly in democratic societies, it's not something we can control. So it's a pretty poor target for coordinated climate action. Increased affluence, quite frankly, right? It's the goal of human economic activity. And it's, there's no way we should be denying that to people who suffer from a severe shortage of it or a lack of it. So for instance, developing countries. So it's also typically a pretty poor target for coordinated climate action. Although next week we can talk more about whether that actually is a possible target for us, as at least as faith communities. Greenhouse gas intensity, that's obviously the remaining possible target. So that's why we spend some time sort of clarifying what that is. Again, make sure you understand this formula. What it means is, I mean, you can see this. What it really means is where we really can target most of our energy is at reducing carbon intensity. So obviously, the more renewables we use in place of greenhouse gas producing fuels, the better off we'll be. Learning efficiency around energy intensity is another thing that we should be focusing on. We'll see that. So here we go. So how do we do this? Reducing energy intensity is there are some things we can do, and Oregon is moving on that front, not as quickly as we would hope. Again, that's the big news from the state of Washington this last week. They really adopted some very strict building codes that move them actually to the forefront in the United States now in terms of efficiency of buildings. Oregon's moving in that direction, not as quickly as we would have expected given the 2022 session, the short session. We'll talk more about that. But, obviously, again, one of the places to do that is maximizing the efficiency of buildings. So energy efficiency, appliances, lighting. You saw yesterday, I believe, the Biden administration reinstituted the attempt to eliminate, come on, what kind of light bulbs? Somebody yell it. Do I see this news? Incandescent light bulbs, yeah. So the Trump administration allowed that back. Now the Biden administration says we're going to move to eliminate those decisively now. Increasing the efficiency of manufacturing processes, the efficiency of means of transportation, shipping distances, a long list of ways we can improve efficiency. And those efficiencies, some people estimate, can get us 40% of the way to what we need to do in terms of reducing emissions. The other obvious place then is to reduce carbon intensity, again, by getting rid of fossil fuels, replacing them with low carbon and carbon-free energy sources. So I think I mentioned this last week as a part of the Metro Climate Action Team subgroup on transportation. We had this debate as to whether, as Oregon improves its clean fuels program, whether we would support the use of, and I'm gonna get this wrong again, blue hydrogen, I think is the right term. And in the end, the group said yes. The anxiety is over fugitive methane emissions associated with that. So it's just kind of, making these sorts of judgments. Do we go to carbon-free energy sources, or do we allow for a time low carbon energy sources? So I hope you're following this. These are the two components of reducing our intensity. Come on. All right. There we go. So what's Oregon done so far to meet the challenge? Before March 2020, Oregon had done a number of things, bits and pieces. So the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, which some of you may be familiar with, I bet you're familiar with, Doug. So 2016 to the present, and it's undergoing revision right now. So there are actually invitations for public comment on the new possibilities right now. Strengthening it to meet the new targets, the new goals. The Zero Emission Vehicles Bill from Senate Bill 1044 in 2019, supporting and encouraging the purchase of zero emission vehicles. The declared greenhouse gas reduction goals that have been in place and now have been improved recently. And then Origo, which is a local road usage charge pilot program here in Oregon, which we talked a bit about last week, and perhaps we'll come back yet tonight, but certainly next week. And then the DEQ has a nice list. You can click on the link. I'm not going to go there right now. But the problem before March 2020 was that there wasn't any real comprehensive approach in Oregon that really would accomplish or achieve the kind of speed and scale of adaptation and mitigation mostly that's really necessary, but also encouraging the kind of carbon removal capacity that Oregon has through its forests and its working lands. And legislative action, as some of you know well, I'm sure, I mean, all of you probably, that was just missing in Oregon. And in fact, when there were attempts to pass legislation that might be meaningful, we had Republicans leaving the legislature so that nothing could be passed. So it really put the state in the position of, not being able to develop state level coordinated action that's necessary for that speed and scale component that's so important if we're actually going to address the issue. So that's why Governor Brown in 2020, whatever you may think of Governor Brown, this was one of her great successes. I don't always think highly of her, but so this is important. She issued an executive order, which in this case, I do want to take you to this. So let me stop the share for just a moment. It's an important document. That was a courageous sort of thing to do, I think, from her position. The fact that she couldn't run again, maybe isn't so courageous, but so directing state agencies to take actions to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And you got the whereases, and they are, you can read through them at your leisure sometime. So therefore, it is hereby directed and ordered that state agencies, the following ones. So, and here's the list. These are the new GHG reduction goals. So consistent with minimum GHG reduction goals set forth in ORS 468A, this executive order establishes science-based GHG emissions reduction goals and calls for the state of Oregon to reduce its emissions at least 45% below 1990 emissions levels by 2035 and at least 80% by 1990 by 2050. So much more ambitious. And then the general directives, state agencies were to sort of pay attention to the GHG reduction goals, expedite their agency processes. In other words, do their business more efficiently to achieve these goals. And their agency decisions now should be guided by these principles having to do with reducing GHGs, helping vulnerable populations, and doing this with a concern for environmental justice. So that's set in motion, and there are more components of this that you can read through sometime if you like. But it was a very important executive order that she issued, and it set in motion all kinds of things subsequently that continue today. Okay, so this is a quicker summary. So, right, directed relevant state agencies to facilitate reaching the goals through expedited processes and procedures, planning, budgeting, investing efforts. Really important here with specific timelines for the issuance of the plans. That's key, and not all of them have behaved particularly well around that. We'll see. So she also issued some targeted directives specific to the work of various state agencies. The big ones, obviously, the Department of Environmental Quality, Oregon Department of Transportation, and the state agencies, for instance, having to do with land use. So what happened? So have people done stuff? Well, yeah, actually. So mitigation. Nice example of this was the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Climate Protection Program. Again, I'm not going to click on the link. That was actually passed in December of this last year, agreed upon. It was an interesting process getting there. I think I might have mentioned this to you last week. I don't remember. The first draft of it was viewed by business and industry as very unwelcome. And so they insisted that it go back for review, but that opened up the public comment period again. and it backfired on them. So the second draft actually was more challenging to business and to industry than the first draft had been. So it is a sign of, the power of public comment. It was because people took it upon themselves to really get their voices heard. And as a consequence, what many in industry were trying to forestall actually got to be more challenging for them. Another example of mitigation, and this is the one that's sort of disappointing. So in the 2022 sessions, Senate Bill 1518, resilient and efficient. Come on, get out of there. Show thumbnail video. What is that? I have no idea. A resilient and efficient buildings task force is what we ended up with. It was Senate Bill 1518 was a reach code. So an ambitious sort of approach to allowing, it's a little complex to explain, but it essentially would hasten the use of building codes that would sort of encourage, undergird greater efficiency. The legislature was a combination of folks who were quite sincere in their view that we could do better than what Senate Bill 1518 was, as well as folks who didn't want this to pass. They basically joined forces and said, we're not going to pass the new codes or the freedom to make new codes at the local level. Instead, we're going to establish a task force to come up with a better set of guidelines. There are some sunset clauses on that, so something will happen. It's going to take some time. And if you follow Oregon politics, just because the legislature says something should happen doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. So it's another instance of, we've got to be watchful, we got to pay attention, we've got to stay on top of it. An example of carbon removal, I mentioned this, I think, last week. The Oregon Department of Forestry has gone through a sea change in the last couple of years. So a new state forester, a change over in the membership on the Oregon, is it? I've forgotten it. It's the board of, it's a board of directors that essentially works with the state forester. Used to be dominated by industry folks. Now it's got a better balance of industry folks, private forest land owners, and environmentalists, and the private land foresters actually a couple of folks, one whose name is just Ben, something is just slipping my mind right now. But anyway, he and his family own a working forest in the central Willamette Valley and are implementing smart foresting policies there. And he's bringing all of that is sustainable foresting policies that really do focus on carbon sequestration. He's bringing that to the Oregon Department of Forestry. So things really have moved in the right direction. It's impressive to see. And again, that has a lot to do with public pressure and public comment. People have been pushing for this for a long time. The climate change and carbon plan, November 2021, we can come back to. It's another important development in terms of carbon removal. Adaptation, there's a lot to be done yet in the 2022 legislation. Some things happened that were good. So Senate Bill 1536, the heat relief for communities and renters bill passed, which essentially will provide funding for low-income households and neighborhoods to purchase heat pumps so that when we face another heat wave, people are going to have adequate cooling in homes where particularly vulnerable in frontline communities, as well as tribal communities. The Farmworker overtime bill that passed in the 2022 legislation also doesn't look like something that speaks directly to climate adaptation, but the reality is this: in Oregon, since 1938, farm workers have not been obliged to pay farm workers overtime. Now they will be obliged to pay farm workers overtime, which has the effect of hastening, encouraging owners, farm owners, employing these farm workers to pull people from the fields, particularly when conditions get terrible. So if you remember this last summer, this bill was really inspired by the man who died alone laying irrigation pipe from heat exhaustion, a farm worker, a Hispanic farm worker. So here's the see, however, the really bold move from Washington State, and I do want to click on this so we can see it. So just announced 5 days ago. Oops, that's not what I wanted you to see. Let's try it again, sorry. It's gonna work. Yeah, there we go. So Washington State takes the strongest, hold on a sec here. Let's see the strongest clean commercial building action in the US. State Building Code Council adopts energy codes requiring new commercial buildings to heat with electricity. That's the key. So moving to an all electric approach. Excuse me, the vote was 11-3, symbolically taken on April 22nd, Earth Day. Nicely done, Washington State. The reality is Oregon might have been close if we had passed something like the REACH code. But again, sort of the foot dragging in the Oregon legislature can slow us down from time to time. Go back to the slide share. So that's progress that we've made since the executive order from the governor. Legislative progress, most importantly, HB 2021 in the 2021 legislative session, upping the ante. So zero emissions from energy, that is electricity or energy production, by 2040. That was a big move. It passed, with no bipartisan support. So of course, it will face challenges down the road, but it was an important move on the part of Oregon's legislature to move toward that 100% below the baseline emission levels by 2040. Another way to think about the legislative progress, and here is, again, I want to share this with you. The Oregon Environmental Council does a nice job of keeping track of the things that we actually accomplish. So you can go to this at OEC's website. So this is what came from the 2022 legislation. So policy wins in the area of efficient and resilient buildings and communities. They're doing their work. So they view 1518 as a win. I'm not sure I do entirely. It passed, yes, but it passed only establishing a task force, but we're moving in the right direction. 1536, I already mentioned, the emergency heat relief for communities and renters. Changes to rulemakings and cost assessments, which OEC opposed. It was blocked effectively, so that was an industry bill. Some other examples: climate and equitable transportation. Let's see, do I want to? Yeah, so changes to the electric vehicle rebate, limiting local regulation transportation network companies, the SB 1558. So OEC had opposed a problematic section here, and the problematic section was taken out. So the section would have eliminated the cap on the number of EV rebates a company can access. Obviously, that's not helping increase EV sales. So an important piece. Other ones. So here's the farm worker overtime bill, important. This did not pass. This was disappointing. Protections for climate impacted workers. It would have defined climate impacted workers and made sure that these folks would have been able to stop work under conditions that are climate related problems. That is problematic conditions that are related to climate change. So that needs to come back, and it will come back. There's a number of folks working on it. So you get the idea. This is a nice resource in terms of seeing what happened. Here's another disappointment, I should say. the Natural and Working Lands Bill, which a lot of people thought would pass without difficulty, SB 1534. So it was to increase carbon sequestration on natural and working lands. So it was a big bill. It had a lot to do with forests, as well as farmland. Everybody thought that farmers would be in support of it, and so nobody put a lot of energy into directing legislators to vote in favor. And the opposing forces were much more active. They won the day. So that one's going to have to come back. Okay. But you get the idea. So Oregon's making progress. And if you've been watching Oregon politics for even 20 years, you know that getting something done in Oregon's legislature can be really tough. And the reality is, in spite of all of the impediments and all of the infighting and the partisanship, things are happening. People are moving in the right direction. So what does that really mean? Okay. What it really means is the state of Oregon's made commitments to reduce these GHG emissions, particularly ones that are affiliated with our economic activity. That's mitigation. They're making plans to ensure that the natural and working lands perform maximally, right? So making plans. And the state of Oregon promises to protect people who are most vulnerable. But the reality is, enacting all of this still really depends on Oregon's legislature, its governor, its agencies, and, as I say, most of all, its citizens, because these folks, the legislature, the governor, and the agencies, really, in the end, are going to be responsive to us, to the people who are telling them this is what we need. And the proof of the pudding is in another document I'll show you in a few moments. So there really is a plan for that, right? Understanding and achieving social tipping points. We'll talk about that next week. How do we participate? How do we help create these social tipping points where it becomes just the next thing, the next natural thing to do to enact the plans that we have sort of set out for ourselves, fulfill the commitments that we've made, and achieve the promises that we've made. So we'll see what you can do. Okay. So in the meantime, action items. I said this last week, and I do this weekly. My state legislature, maybe that's why she's quitting. I don't know. There's too many of us doing this. I'm Rachel Prusak is my state representative, and she is quitting because state representatives need to be paid more. That's the truth. But you just need to hound them about these things. And if you send a note, make a telephone call, leave a message, and mention these things in the 2023 legislative session, we got to get back to something like Senate Bill 1534. We need to get back to something like the HCR 203, protecting workers from climate impacts. So contacting them in the between sessions, that's when it really does make a difference. Another thing you can do this week, if you're interested, is to read the Divest Oregon's Risky Business. Again, I want to share this with you. Report that was just issued this past week. So those of you who are familiar with the Divest Oregon movement, I mentioned it last week. Susan Palmater is the chief leader of this. Really, really smart people. They're doing super work. They're pushing Oregon's treasury to divest from fossil fuel investments. One of the candidates for governor, Tobias Reed, is the state treasurer, has consistently been kind of slippery on this. I was attending the City Club. City Club of Portland has been doing just 30 minutes. Every couple of weeks, they get a new candidate for governor, and they spend 30 minutes on Zoom asking questions and allowing participants to ask questions. and he got some serious pushback on his behavior around this. You may know in the 2022 session, there was a bill to sort of force the Treasury to be transparent in its investments. He said that that was the first step toward divestment, and without that, it wouldn't be possible. So they tried to get a bill passed. The Treasury did not support the bill. The bill did not pass. So now Divest Oregon has sort of gone straight to the attempt to force divestment without the Treasury transparency. So really nicely done report. There's a report summary at the link that you can read. And what the bad news is, Oregon's, for instance, PERS is heavily invested in fossil fuels, which in fact is a bad bet. It's a terrible bet. We know that now. We can see the evidence of it in terms of returns. So it's a great report. Read it and track some of that and become involved with Divest Oregon. They know how to get you involved. You can also check out Evergreen Action, which is the result really of Jay Inslee's campaign for president. Short-lived that it was. It really focused on climate action, and his group of advisors, sort of the brain trust that he developed to do that, has formed Evergreen Action. And they work both at the national level in terms of pushing smart policy, but also regionally. So a lot of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and to the extent that it's possible, California. And they are, I don't know if you saw that, they were rated I can't remember, it's the standard outfit that rates charities at the end of each calendar year, and Evergreen Action was rated as one of the best to give your money to because of the work they're doing. Finally, some reading material. If you really are interested in knowing the science of climate change, as well as the politics and social dimensions, Andrew Dressler's book, Introduction to Modern Climate Change, is really super readable. Even the most difficult science parts where he explains joules of energy and such things, he does it in terms that are really easy for the layperson to understand. I'll actually use this as a course textbook a year from now. Well, not a little less than a year from now, when I teach a course on religion and climate change at Lewis and Clark. And it's the book I'm going to make them swallow at the beginning so they know what it is we're talking about. This book is a science fiction novel. The Minister for the Future, some of you may have heard of it, by Kim Stanley Robinson, who's been writing climate fiction, so-called cli-fi instead of sci-fi, cli-fi, for some time now. This was published in 2020. It says below, what one reader describes as a harrowing and hopeful sci-fi novel about a climate changed very near future. So kind of indefinite, 2030 maybe is where it begins. It's hard to put a date on it. But it is both. It's harrowing, but it is hopeful. I mean, and it's based in the science. If you're ever interested, there's an interview with him in a recent issue of the New Yorker that's pretty helpful in terms of understanding where he's coming from. But the thing about it that makes it such a good read is it treats you to a well-informed perspective on what's likely to happen with climate change impacts globally, but at the same time constructs in a reasonably realistic way a fairly hopeful scenario, if that seems possible. So there you go. So next week, what we'll talk about is the things you could be doing, right? The things that you can actually sort of get your hands around, get your hands dirty to do, and particularly at the state level, what it is we can do to help move the ball forward, because it is moving forward at the state level. That's the good news. It really is. And as long as citizens are pushing hard, it will continue to move forward. Without that, though, it won't. So that's the key component. And the other thing we'll talk about next week is, remember the 3 factors. So we can reduce population, not likely. We can reduce affluence, or we can reduce our carbon intensity. So one of the things I think we want to talk about is, what does it mean to accept lifestyle changes in order to achieve real reduction. So last thing I'll say before we just open up to conversation, anybody see the interview with Václav Siml in the New York Times this past week? So Václav Siml is a guy who's been talking about energy transitions as a scientist for half a century. He's 78. It's a book coming out in a couple of weeks. And he is a really, really hard-nosed realist who insists that all of our talk of getting to zero as quickly as we are thinking we can get to zero in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is just so much pie in the sky. It was a terribly depressing article to read. And I'll tell you at the same time, for somebody who's interested in these things, it was enthralling. And this is what happened. So I think I've said this, I might have said this to you last week. I'm teaching 4 classes in a row this semester. Today was the last day. So if my voice sounds like it's going away, that's because, I'm exhausted. And I was between my 3rd and 4th class on Monday. And I decided I needed to eat something, and I was going to take the 10 minutes to just take a quick look at the news. And I started reading Václav Siml's interview. And before I know it, I have a student standing at my door saying, "Professor Kugler, are you coming to class?" In 30 years of teaching, this has never happened to me. But I was absolutely appalled, enthralled. I just couldn't leave it. Because this is kind of what we face, right? This is where we are. And when you hear somebody with that kind of authority speaking about these issues in those terms, I can't take my eyes off it, or my ears off it, as it were. So so let's open it up to conversation. A lot of information, I know.
Rob, I noticed under the renewable resources, you had nuclear power. And, I remember 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and all those things. Is it a matter of just weighing out, the lesser of 2 evils kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole. This is, and it's not actually a renewable, but it's a non-GHG, right? Producing power. Doug probably knows more about this than I do, but the stuff I do know about nuclear energy these days is sort of the good and the bad. So the good is the ability to produce energy and not produce the waste. That is, we're able to produce more energy with less waste than before. That's good news. So we probably could do this with less, not no, but less anxiety about what we're producing and storing it sufficiently for sufficient time and so forth. Problem is, to ramp up nuclear energy to replace fossil fuels right now, it just takes too much money and too much time. I list it because I think existing nuclear facilities should continue to be used, and we should do everything we can to make sure they're safe, et cetera. All the things that we, the sensible things you would do. We shouldn't be giving up on them. So Europe's facing that question right now, as particularly, as they see the gas main being shut off from Russia. So the plans to mothball some facilities are having to be put on hold. So I just think it's part of the mix that we just have to have. We can't throw it away when it's an energy source that that can serve us. Over long haul, as that technology improves, we're probably going to have to be using some of it. And again, I think I mentioned to you guys last week, Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who insists that water, wind, and sun, we have enough of all three to power the American economy. And it's just a matter of learning how to harness that. He's trying to address the question of storage as well, but that's another issue.
Yeah, there's been a number of studies, although I've kind of slipped away from being in touch with them, of basically managing a portfolio of renewable energies across time and geographic scales, which would provide plenty of energy. Right. It's a matter of putting together the infrastructure, and that it would be at less cost than nuclear options. Yeah. So, it could be a cost issue and not even a technology issue. But yeah, there's studies showing integration of geothermal, tidal, wind, solar, hydro, renewable hydrogen, et cetera, that indicate that a system where these are all intertwined could easily supply our needs at a reasonable cost. So obviate whether nuclear is even necessary at that point.
Yeah. I mean, like I was, my view is it's where it is probably necessary as a, where it exists as a bridge that's a non-GHG emitting bridge energy. Because the problem, Václav Simel is one of the discouraging things he had to say in this article. He said, that's true. He agrees. He doesn't dispute what Mark Smith at Stanford, you're noting the fact that we have we have access to enough renewable energy to power our economy. He says, but the problem is we lack the infrastructure to distribute it effectively at this point, particularly on a national basis. So he says, without that, so what? The naysayer, but so again, it's our willingness, that is government's willingness, and our willingness to bear the costs to do it. So I'll let you guys. I could ramble on. Anybody else? Yeah.
Are you aware of coalitions or church groups that are coming together? I'm thinking of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, but are there other places that are collaborating on climate justice issues?
It's not so much, EMO is, at the state level. In terms of other organizations, like, big organizations, there's the Evangelical, it's a network of evangelicals right now, who are green in their thinking. And I'm forgetting the acronym exactly. And they're a good voice. This is going to sound terrible. So one of the things that's happening now is, and rightly so, is the intense interest in making the transition justly. So being careful to attend to those in greatest need, et cetera. There are other folks, the sort of hard-nosed realists who say, yes, but the most urgent need is to move. What's the phrase that I am getting tired? Speed and scale. The speed and scale requirement at this point may at times force us to make compromises on the justice front. So that's where I do think faith communities and faith community groups can be helpful, but also have to be engaged in a real dialogue that says, okay, what can we do? What can we accomplish? How can we be just in doing this? and at the same time achieve the speed and scale that's necessary. Yeah. So, but in terms of other groups, and I'll try and remember to get this for you, the Evangelical Network, because they're good. I mean, they've got a good, and they're surprising. Many people would not expect that from those.
You're thinking of an evangelical, not eco-faith recovery, or
no.
Rob, I think it's called Evangelical Environmental Network.
There you go. Yep.
EEN.
Yeah.
And there's a subgroup called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action.
Yep.
Sorry, what's it called again?
Young Evangelicals for Climate
Oh,
Action.
okay, all right.
Yeah.
YECA.
So Evangelical Environmental Network. EEN. I knew it was E something N.
EN.
Yep. Yeah, and they're good. I mean, they're paying attention. The history of American evangelicalism. In my apocalyptic imagination course, I teach this book, American Apocalypse. And he devotes, I mean, it's a sort of frightening story going back to the middle of the 19th century. It's like, great book. If you ever want another book to read, American Apocalypse by, his last name is Sutton, Sutton. And it's a history of American evangelicalism, but he notes, in contemporary evangelicalism, there is this emerging, it's basically a return to one of the old traditions of evangelicalism that was very committed to social justice. And it's populated largely by young people. You find a lot of very young people associated with it.
So the Lutherans Restoring Creation is, I don't know if anybody from Prince of Life has had some contacts with that group, or they're out of Minneapolis. It's a kind of a national. Lutherans Restoring Creation, LRC. They've been around for 10 or 15 years. And they have some, resources there. And I had been involved in some of their work in the past, and workshops and whatever.
Yeah.
Years ago, I heard about some potential energy things of like developing small scale hydropower that they could put in, just a regular river or creek, but not have a huge dam and power plant and everything, that would provide local electricity for a few houses or something, and using renewable natural gas as a transition. Are some of those still happening, or did they not work?
I don't know anything about small hydroelectric. I mean, so-called renewable natural gas. Yes, that's and among activists these days, the question is, I mean, what does that mean? Renewable natural gas? That was a marketing ploy on the part of the natural gas folks. Let's be honest. So natural gas is turning out to be. We talked about this a bit last week. I think the bridge fuel that isn't really a very good bridge fuel. Particularly the methane emissions associated with natural gas production. Again, Václav Simel in his article, the interview with him, he argues a much more hard-nosed approach to this. He said, you can catch those fugitive methane emissions, and we've got to rely on natural gas. It's much better than we think it is. But again, the problem is industry is terrible about capturing the fugitive methane emissions because that costs them something. And they're much more inclined to just flare that stuff off. And as we saw last week, methane emissions are 25 to 35 times more powerful than carbon GHGs. Shorter lived in the atmosphere, but really pretty damaging in the short run. But yeah, you hear for a while there, you heard, for instance, about the creation of tiny nuclear reactors you could put in your basement. We hear these things from time to time.
Back in the late 1970s, Nyan, is that how you say your name?
Mm-hmm.
I worked for Portland General Electric, and in a little office that kind of managed small scale renewables at the time. And we did have a couple of small scale hydro. I mean,
oh, cool.
Real small. And gosh, the only constraint was these 2 or 3 people had a stream in their backyard, which had a considerable, drop of, to create the energy. But not everybody has that. And they worked, and Portland General paid them for the energy that they produced.
Very cool.
But I had not heard of anything else. While I was there for 20 years, except on a water systems, city water systems. If they need to reduce the pressure, so they will reduce the pressure by creating some energy. And I know out in Beaverton, I forget which water district it is, does do small scale hydropower, energy that reducing the pressure in their water system. So yeah, that's happening. But the thing is, I'm a solar power advocate. Everybody's roof, as long as there's not trees over it, has access to solar power, and it's cheaper these days too. So
Yep.
But we have smaller scale nuclear, don't we? Have nuclear submarines that are powered by nuclear?
Yeah.
And that's smaller scale.
Yeah. I just don't know enough about it to say anything sensible. So, yeah.
Is there concern with the solar, with having to have the battery backup because solar isn't available 24 hours, with the rare minerals that are needed in order to develop batteries?
Yeah, there's those considerations. Now, we use solar in our 2 homes for many years without any batteries at all. We just exchange power with the grid system, and so if the grid goes down, then the power goes out. But that's a different deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to. We're running out of time, but the thing I want to really stress is the fact that we do need speed and scale. So scale only comes by state level, regional level, and finally national level, finally international level action. So, while we can, and we'll talk about that next week, what we can do to reduce our own footprint. Lots of things we can do, obviously. And that has a lot to do with that A in the equation of intensity and population. So affluence. So what kind of changes in our own affluence are we willing to accept to accomplish this? But at the end of the day, to tackle the global problem, it really is going to take advocacy on the part of citizens to make sure that legislators do the right thing, and that we elect the right kind of folks. So I'll reiterate what I said last week: pay attention to politics. So I bet you guys are getting the flyers from all of these. Oregon's in a state of flux. We've got a new congressional district, and a lot of candidates vying for that new position. Peculiar things happening. One of them getting millions of dollars from the Democratic Party, who's kind of a mystery candidate. Andrea Salinas is not the mystery candidate. League of Conservation Voters has made it really clear that's who they support. And that's the sort of stuff. That's where, in terms of getting scale accomplished and eventually speed, it really is going to depend on who sits in those offices. So it's a thing we got to pay a lot of attention to.
So Rob,
Thank you, Rob.
did you put up as a reference last week, you keep using these terms speed and scale about the book?
I didn't put a reference to the book. Yeah.
Next week, or?
Yeah. Have you read it yet?
No, but it's on my list.
Yeah, it's on my list too. I'm not sure. I gotta decide how much of this stuff can I read before I just feel like oversaturated. Yeah, there's a book.
You only get to do so much.
Yep, that's right. It's a book that's titled Speed and Scale, and who is it by? I can't remember. it's a business guy. So it's, somebody with business background who really thinks we can do it. We just have to put our shoulder to the wheel. So, and get Joe Manchin to agree to something.
All right, we better call it a night. Thanks, Rob.
All right, John.
Appreciate
So
it.
yeah, I'll send you an email because I got to figure out what we're doing.
Rob, good to see you.
Yep. See you guys. Yeah.
All right,
So
we'll
see you next week.